Hi, I'm Kirsty Louise and today I'm going to show you how to make this quilted ruffle book sleeve. You'll find a link to this pattern in the description of this video. Once you've printed and assembled the sewing pattern, you'll need to cut out your pattern pieces. You'll need to have 2 outer panels, 2 lining panels, and 2 panels out of your choice of wadding. I'm using this fusible wadding. You'll need 2 book sleeve ties and also 1 long strip of fabric for your ruffles. I'm doing both of these in the same colour as my lining fabric. Place one of your outer panels on top of the wadding with the right side facing up. If you're using a fusible wadding like me, give that a really good iron to hold it in place. Now we're going to mark our quilting lines. I'm using a Hera marker to mark mine, but any kind of fabric marker is absolutely fine. Just make sure it's either air or water erasable, as these lines will be visible once we've finished our project. I'm going for a diamond quilted effect for this book sleeve, and I find the easiest way to do this is to mark an X on my fabric using my Hera marker, and then I use my quilt guide bar to guide me through the rest of the lines. If you don't have a quilt guide bar, you can just mark all of your lines before you head over to the sewing machine. Using a regular straight stitch, I'm carefully sewing over the X that I marked on the fabric. You don't need to backstitch any of your quilting lines. These will all be locked in once we assemble the book sleeve. Once that's done, I line the guide bar up with one of the X lines, and then I just sew all the way down. I do this until I have all of my diagonal lines facing one way. Which should look something like this, and then I repeat the same thing using that second X line as my starting point. And once that's done, it should look something like this. Repeat these steps for the other outer panel. Fold the ruffle fabric in half lengthways, right sides together. Clip each side to hold it in place. With a regular straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew down the short edge of each side, backstitch at the beginning and the end. Trim down the seam allowance of each side. This removes bulk and gives us a nice crisp finish when we turn it right side out. Now turn the fabric right side out. I find using my point turner really helps push out the seam. I only got a point turner recently, and it's one of those tools that you don't realise how much you need it until you have it. To be honest, the point turner, Hera marker and the quilt guide bar are 3 tools that aren't 100% necessary, but they make my life so much easier. Once both sides are turned right side out, give the whole strip a really good iron. Then take it over to your sewing machine, make sure it's set to a straight stitch and the longest stitch length with the highest tension. This is going to really help to gather the fabric. I line my fabric up so the raw edge of the fabric lines up nicely with the edge of my presser foot. I then put my needle into the right hand position and sew all the way along. Do not backstitch at the beginning or the end. If you need to gather your fabric more, carefully pull on the bobbin thread and gather the fabric until it matches the width of the book sleeve. This can sometimes be a little bit tedious, but just be careful, don't pull too hard on the thread as you don't want the thread to snap. Take one of your outer panels and mark 3/4 inch in from one of the long edges. Do this on the top and the bottom. This is going to be the start and stop point of your ruffles. Starting from the point you just marked, clip or pin the ruffled strip around 3 edges of the book sleeve. In this instance, both shorter edges and one of the longer edges. You want the raw edge of the ruffle and the raw edge of the book sleeve to be meeting. Do this all the way around until you reach your stop point. You can pop this to one side while we work on the ties. Fold each of the ties in half lengthways, right sides together. Clip or pin them to hold them in place. Set your sewing machine back to a regular tension and stitch length. Then, with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew down the raw edge of the tie all the way to the point. Backstitch at the beginning and the end. The shorter straight edge of the tie should remain unsewn. Repeat these same steps for the second tie. Trim down both of the points of the ties. This will reduce the bulk for when we turn it right side out. You want to cut as close as you can to the seam without actually cutting through the stitches. Now carefully turn the ties right side out. Use something with a pointy end to push out the point. My point turner was a little bit too big for this, so I used the end of an old makeup brush. Then just give both ties a really good iron. To attach the ties, we need to find the centre point of the outer panels. I fold the outer panel in half and then make a mark with my fabric pen. I then take the second outer panel, make sure it's facing the correct way, line it up with the panel I've just marked, and draw a little line with my fabric pen. With the longer pointy end of the tie facing the top, clip or pin the raw edge of the tie to the raw edge of the book sleeve. I like to leave a little bit of overhang. Repeat this with the other side. With an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, sew both of the ties in place. To assemble the book sleeve, place the outer panels right sides together. Move the ties out of the way so they don't accidentally get sewn. Then you want to clip or pin the fabric to hold it in place. You're only going to sew the 3 edges that you've clipped. You're not going to sew the edge with the ties. Using a regular straight stitch and a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, sew along those 3 edges. Backstitch at the beginning and the end. When you reach each of the corners, make sure your needle is in the fabric, lift up the presser foot, swivel the fabric around, pop the presser foot back down and continue to sew. Now you're going to cut across each of these corners. Cut a straight line as close as you can to the stitches without actually cutting through the stitches. Again, this removes bulk when we turn it right side out. You're now going to repeat the exact same steps for the lining fabric. Place the lining fabric right sides together and clip or pin it to hold it in place. The only difference with the lining fabric is we're going to leave a 4-inch gap in the longer edge. This is what we'll use to turn the fabric right side out. So take that over to your sewing machine and with a regular straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew down one of the shorter edges. Then you want to start sewing up the longer edge and stop when you get to the first point that you've marked. Make sure to backstitch at all of your start and stop points. I then make sure my needle is in the highest position, I lift up my presser foot and I just carefully pull the fabric along to the second point that I've marked. Once it's in the right place, I pop the presser foot back down, pop the needle back into the fabric and continue to sew, remembering to backstitch. Turn your outer panels right side out. Open up your lining and place the outer book sleeve into the lining so the right sides are facing. Align the raw edges and make sure the seams of the outer panels and the lining are meeting. You can then clip or pin the entire outer edge to hold it in place. Make sure you're tucking both of the ties into the lining. If you can, remove the free arm of your sewing machine. This just makes this part of sewing a little bit easier. Now, with a regular straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew around that entire edge. Backstitch at the beginning and the end. Carefully pull the book sleeve out through the opening of the lining. If you're happy with how everything looks, fold in the opening seam of the lining, clip or pin it to hold it in place, and then take it over to your sewing machine and sewing as close as you can to that edge, sew the opening closed. It should look something like this when you're done. Now push the lining into the book sleeve, and I recommend giving everything a really good iron at this point. I didn't feel my fabric needed it, so I did skip this step. Now you just want to clip or pin the entire outer edge. And what we're going to do next is we're going to top stitch the outer edge, which is going to hold the lining in place and also just give it a really clean finish. Using a regular straight stitch and a 1/4 inch seam allowance, start from the top of the book sleeve and sew all the way down to the bottom, back stitching at the beginning and the end. If you've decided not to add ruffles, you'll be able to sew all the way around, but because the ruffles are in the way for this one, I'm sewing one side and then the other. Now all you need to do is snip away any loose threads, and then your quilted ruffle book sleeve is complete. I absolutely love making these. I think they make a really great gift, and if you're a small business, you're more than welcome to use this pattern to make book sleeves to sell for your business. If you do, I'd absolutely love you to tag me in your makes. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I would love and appreciate if you could give this video a like and subscribe to my channel.